Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are, and welcome to this Geneva Network webinar on the importance of intellectual property rights for future pandemic preparedness. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Philip Stevens. I'm the Executive Director of Geneva Network, which is a research and advocacy organisation working on international innovation policy. So a bit of background to today. The COVID pandemic continues. Entering into different phase depending which country you're in, but instrumental to the position we find ourselves in now is the development of a multiple vaccines and billions of doses manufactured over the last year or so, and now we're at a position where vaccine doses are outstripping demand. So the policy discussion is to an extent turning to future pandemics. And there's some advocates calling for a discussion of the role of IP in preparing for future pandemics. Should it be limited or waived? And this discussion continues with the WTO waiver in Geneva as well. And this is the topic of today's discussion. I've assembled this panel of esteemed experts to give their views on this discussion. We're going to talk about the role of intellectual property rights, both in innovation for pandemic technologies, but also for building sustainable manufacturing capacity in all parts of the world that need it. We have a range of voices to contribute to this discussion, and I'm very delighted they've made time to be with us today. First up, we have Simon Agwale, who's Chief Executive Officer of innovative Biotech Nigeria Limited, who joins us actually today from Maryland, United States. He's also with the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative. We have Julie Barnes-Weise, who's the Executive Director of the Global Health Innovation Alliance Accelerator, also in the United States. We have Professor Mark Schultz, who's the Professor of Intellectual Property Law at the University of Akron, United States, and Senior Fellow at the Geneva Network, and has written widely on IP and COVID topics. And we have Shanker Singham, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Competere and Chairman of Global Economic Neural Networks from the United Kingdom, I believe, joining us today from the United States. And he's written widely on trade and competition policy. So we've got 1 hour. The webinar will finish on the hour exactly. There's no presentations today. It's going to be a structured Q&A. I'm going to take people through. And first of all, we're going to talk about, to set the scene, we're going to talk about the challenges of scaling up vaccine manufacturing. And I'm going to turn first of all to Simon Agwale, who has plenty of hands-on experience of developing manufacturing plants and facilities in Africa and elsewhere. First of all, I wanted to ask you, Simon, what you think of the strengths of vaccine manufacturing are in Africa, and what do you think the potential is for that sector in the continent? You're on mute, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be here. We all know now that the current state of vaccine manufacturing in Africa is rudimental, because less than 1% of all the vaccines that are currently used in Africa are manufactured locally. This, situation makes the continent, as we saw in the COVID-19 pandemic, vulnerable to epidemics and pandemic. And because of that, the African Center for Disease Control and Prevention came up with a very ambitious goal of making sure that we manufacture 60% of the vaccines that are currently used in Africa locally by 2040. That means that we have to be producing between 1.5 to 1.7 billion doses of the vaccines every year in the continent. So we know that this will require significant investment in new and existing vaccine technologies and production processes. However, the COVID-19 has accelerated the amount of technology transfers that have been initiated on the continent from just 3 before 2020 to now over 10 announcements since 2020. Unfortunately, all these, 80 to 90% of these initiatives are focused on the downstream side of things, which is the fill finish, without replant for the actual production of the drug substance. For example, if you look at the landscape, you find out that based on what is going on and then the announcements that have been made, we have capacity for fill finish of up to 600 million doses of vaccines locally on the continent. And out of that 600, 580 are focused on COVID vaccine. Then if you look at the actual drug substance production, you see that we produce less than 10 million doses of the vaccine. And most of that, which is about 7 million doses yellow fever vaccine from the Institut Pasteur in Dakar. And then you have the rabies, the BCG, which is just about 0.2 million, then 0.5 for flu. So we need significant investment in the actual drug substance production so that we don't run the risk of eventually having fill finish facilities throughout the continent without the drug substance to fill. Thank you.
And then building on that, Simon, so you set out a case for the need for greater capacity within Africa, particularly to manufacture vaccines. I mean, what are the challenges, in your view, of scaling up manufacturing, both in terms of funding and infrastructure?
Well, there are a lot of challenges. The first is that there's as you know, there's high investment in staff development. Tech transfers take time to happen, and then during this time, you have to train your staff. So who pays for that? How can you maintain this pool of talents before you start producing your product and start making profits to take over those responsibilities? The cost of building facility alone is significant. We're looking at between $50 million to $200 million to have a facility built. So the solution will be basically technology transfer from experienced manufacturers to local manufacturers, because we know that this has the potential of bridging the skill gap by transferring the technologies and know-how from experienced manufacturers to local manufacturers. And then we need significant investment from local government and also international partners by coming up with innovative financing, because who pays for during this incubation period, and this can be in form of advanced purchase commitments to encourage the advanced manufacturers to transfer their technology to local manufacturers, and also access to markets, because this is critical. And then we have to come up with some kind of innovative financing, and this is probably one of the only ways that we can help to bridge this gap.
Thanks for that, Simon. And to the people watching, feel free to, if you have a question or a comment, a short comment, that is, would you mind putting it into the Q&A box, and I'll try to get to them as the webinar unfolds. And we don't have a huge amount of time, but I hope to get to one or two of them. And then Simon, just before we move on to Julie, I wanted to ask you, you've set out that more tech transfer needs to take place, but what are the factors in your view that are preventing more deals and more partnerships from setting up in your part of the world? What are the factors holding them back?
Well, I think, like I said, we don't have the right incentives. I mean, if you look at the COVID pandemic, for example, the Serum Institute, partnered with AstraZeneca, and that was tech transfer. And AstraZeneca, Serum Institute of India was supposed to produce AstraZeneca vaccine for the developing countries because they have the capacity to do that. So it's not more in Africa. It's not more about IP waiver, but it's more about know-how and having the capacity to be able to produce and develop and produce the vaccines. So Serum Institute had the capacity, so it was easy for the partnership between AstraZeneca and Serum Institute to happen. The same thing with Novavax and Serum Institute. They have the capacity. So it's not more about IP waiver, but it's about developing the capacity. Because if you have a capacity to produce the vaccines, I think that basically the manufacturers, from the West will be willing and very happy to transfer the technology. So it becomes a win-win situation. So I think there should be more focus on the know-how, how we can build this capacity on the continent, rather than push for IP waiver. Again, having said that, during pandemic, these things have to be carefully looked at differently from the normal process of technology transfer. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. And turning to Julie, building on what Simon has been talking about, you've written a lot about the role of partnerships in global health. I mean, that's the area you focus on the most. So, we'd love your perspective on the role of intellectual property rights in developing these partnerships. How, what's the best way of getting know-how to partners in Africa and elsewhere, in your view? And what's the role of IP in that?
I think Simon made a good point, which is there's a difference between patents. I think IP gets lumped all into one bucket frequently. And there's a difference between patents and all of the proprietary information, especially that's necessary to make vaccines. And of course, it's a little bit different when you're making a tablet versus a vaccine. But I think patents are a right that is transferable through license to other parties. And so it is this building of trust for partnerships, and it was good to hear how many additional tech transfers there are. And I think this is in some ways no different than the process a company would go through normally in developing a relationship with a new partner. So trying first, for instance, a fill finish agreement. And if that goes well with the partner, then expanding that. But I will say that, a patent is an incentive. It's a type of incentive, and it's proven inadequate in some ways, if you look at that as the answer, to reach all of the countries that needed access, especially to vaccines, during this pandemic. So we have to look to other incentives. And to Simon's point about money, patents are in some ways a tool to monetize your invention. But if we need additional incentives, so for partnerships, if you need to have incentives to enter into the partnerships and for companies to take the risk to enter into those partnerships, and for for companies in Africa, for instance, to start to manufacture, then funders, including governments, have to include both obligations in development agreements for these products for the future, as well as the funding to go with those. So if you're going to obligate a company, for instance, if they have a successfully developed vaccine, to transfer it into low and middle income countries, then you need to provide the funding for them to actually do that. And then the funding also, as Simon mentioned, to pull through, to say that if this vaccine or medicine is successfully made, that there'll be a guarantee of purchase of that at the other end. So I think the main role of let's say intellectual property in general is to give partnerships something to agree on, a right to transfer, knowledge to transfer, and something to put funding around to develop in these countries that need to start or continue their own manufacturing. Thanks.
And Julie, while I've got you on, there's a question coming from Pierre Ballard, who asks, with regards to tech transfer agreements for increased manufacturing in low and middle income countries, how important are the staff transfers versus simply sharing patents and other information or data?
Hi, Pierre. Thanks for the question. Obviously, people are incredibly important to this. Both the people that have originated the process, especially for manufacturing, as well as those who can go and teach new people to make the vaccines and other products. And as if you've seen, even the originator companies for some of these vaccines did not have successful transfers the first or second, or I think in some cases even the third attempts at this. So again, this is taking time and it's personnel and it's actually money to do this. And so in preparing for the next pandemic, these need to happen now so that these kinds of partnerships and knowledge begin to be transferred before they're actually needed to be put in place. Thanks.
Thanks, Julie. And I'm going to bring Mark Schultz in now. And I think I'm also going to tag Simon onto this one too. There's been a lot of excitement in the media recently around a South African company called Afrigen, who's managed to create an experimental or early copy of Moderna's mRNA vaccine without infringing or using any of the IP rights of the right holder. That's obviously the first step, but there's quite a long way to go before creating it at scale in the realms of the billions of doses that would be required to be useful as a pandemic tool. And Mark, can you talk a bit more about some of the challenges of scaling up an experimental vaccine into mass manufacturing?
Well, certainly, and I think we're going to talk about some of the innovation in manufacturing in a moment, but I think let's just look at basically the difference between, I guess, invention and manufacturing. And I think sometimes people don't appreciate just how much innovation and investment happens after something is invented, whatever that something is, whether it's a gadget, a tool, or a vaccine. Mass manufacturing can be really challenging. So just being able to produce any treatment at an experimental level is orders of magnitude short of what's needed to manufacture millions or even billions of doses. There's one expert was describing Australia's efforts to get ready to produce a year or so ago to produce vaccines. And this biomanufacturing expert, he quipped that, to produce an mRNA vaccine, to go from the laboratory to the factory, he said, gee, that 2,000 liter reactor with process control and computers hanging off of it doesn't look much like a test tube. That's a real challenge, right? It's one thing to be able to reproduce the invention. It's almost an artisanal thing that really good scientists can do, but then you have to work with the process engineers and the other experts, the people who understand the regulatory compliance, people who can build the supply chain, and you have to establish the supply chain. And then in some research I did last year, we did extensive research. We were able to interview some of the manufacturing executives working on vaccines. And they talked about the need for constant process improvement, that they said, every day we're reacting to improvements, to new regulatory demands, to new discoveries among us and our partner network that allow us to change and develop our process. So there's both expertise in building such a facility and making it work, and then expertise in continuing to keep it functioning well. And there's innovation that goes into developing a new manufacturing process. So it's no small challenge. It's not a matter of having, creating a factory and then putting it under wraps to wait for when it's needed. This is, it's almost a living thing that needs to be built and cared for and constantly improved.
Thanks, Mark. And Simon, do you want to add to that? What do you view of the challenges of moving from that early stage to mass manufacture, based on your own experiences?
That was basically why I talked about partnerships, because that's a good start, and because they have the scientists to make that happen. So there should be the willingness to be able to transfer technology. I mean, from experienced manufacturers to local manufacturers. In this case, Moderna, said that they were not going to enforce their IP rights during pandemic. So this particular company used available information to develop their mRNA vaccine. So I think it's more about terminology, because if I were them, I would have called it a second generation vaccine, because the mode of delivery basically is going to be different than what Moderna is using. So I think we need to encourage, this basically because the know-how, the research and development has to happen on the continent. This is not just about COVID. This is about other vaccines that, against the diseases that are not a problem in the West. So you have to have that capacity. So this demonstrates that, there's a capacity to develop vaccines against the diseases that are unique to the continent, and all the needs is the support from partners, because we can't do this alone. Any support from Moderna, from whoever to make this venture happen, that it becomes a win-win situation, will be greatly appreciated.
Thanks, Simon. And turning back to Mark again, so you already touched on some of the process or manufacturing innovation that's taken place over the last 18 months to 2 years in manufacturing these vaccines. Looking ahead to future pandemics, obviously, if you have a vaccine manufacturing plant, you can't just leave it static. You have to continually improve as new technologies and new facts emerge. You have to constantly experiment and improve the processes. You've touched on that. Do you want to add anything to that and the role of intellectual property rights in underpinning that manufacturing innovation?
Absolutely, thank you. And by the way, I've posted links to 2 papers in the chat function. One I did for Geneva Network with Philip on trade secrecy and COVID-19, and an even longer comprehensive research report that talks about the role of IP in the fight against COVID. We called it Unprecedented, and it documents many of these partnerships, the interviews we did with manufacturing and IP experts from the leading vaccine companies and other developers of treatments. So as I noted, this research gave me an additional appreciation for how much innovation occurs in manufacturing. I think sometimes the discussion gets of biopharma manufacturing gets a little bit stuck in an old paradigm that's still relevant, but of the paradigm of making small molecule drugs. And generally, there is innovation in manufacturing those drugs, but often, they are synthesized by a known process and manufactured by a known process, a process that's so well known that it has enabled the creation of large generic manufacturers globally in many countries. And most of the innovation for the small molecule drugs is focused in the discovery aspect. When we get to biopharmaceuticals, there's innovation at every step. And we're creating new platform technologies, such as the mRNA vaccine technology that had never been used before. Even the adenovirus vector vaccine technology that was used by Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca hadn't really been used in large production yet. And we see this with other, with other relatively new fields in biopharma. The very platform by which we synthesize, by which we create the treatment that we're testing is innovative. The treatment itself is innovative, but then it requires a new manufacturing process. It's often not, it's partly new or completely new because we're dealing with a new technology. It's not a well-known process that you just put into an existing factory. So for example, Pfizer developed a 50,000-step manufacturing process. It had to identify and work with 86 different suppliers. And the Pfizer Biotech vaccine required 280 materials in total. And it wasn't just that it was 280 materials, 10 to 15 of which were novel for the mRNA vaccine. And then through continuing innovation, Pfizer cut the initial production time in half. And there's similar stories of innovation for all of the leading vaccine manufacturers in this pandemic. And so what's the role of IP in that? Well, first, there's an investment made in innovating in manufacturing, and that investment is protected by intellectual property. Then the next thing that happened is Pfizer couldn't do it alone. Moderna couldn't do it alone. Nobody did this alone. They worked with partners. And in our research, we documented, by the end of last summer, we were able to document from public sources many dozens of partnerships around the world for both main manufacturing and, as Simon talked about, fill and finish, the last part of manufacturing. And some of these agreements were with some of these leading, biopharma companies' main competitors. So how did they have the confidence to teach their biggest competitors how to make the vaccine? They relied on their IP rights. How did Pfizer partner with Biotech? They relied, Biotech had confidence because of its IP rights. They were able to trust their partners, but also trust their partners because they had legal backing. And Pfizer, indeed, just the last thing I'll say is Pfizer, it was documented that Pfizer, when Pfizer transferred technology and taught partners how to make the vaccine, it wasn't a matter of a few documents. It was a matter of many months. In one instance, they talked about 50,000 pages of documents, hundreds of trade secrets transferred to a particular manufacturing partner in Italy, an on-site team of 20 people working side by side with their Italian partner for months. So this kind of tech transfer requires a lot of cooperation, a lot of voluntary cooperation, and the underlying confidence created by the foundation of intellectual property rights.
Thanks, Mark. Shanker, don't worry, we haven't forgotten you. We'll be coming on to you in the final third of the webinar. So thanks for hanging tight. I think Julie, one of my colleagues, has just distributed some links, including one to an article by Julie in the British Medical Journal, where she writes, there's a mismatch. This is in referring to the TRIPS waiver, a mismatch between the mechanics of the WTO TRIPS waiver and the intended increase in the global production and distribution of vaccines. Bit of a big question, but could you just sort of unpack what you mean there, with reference to the debate, not just on the TRIPS waiver, but the sort of the more nascent debate on a future pandemic treaty and the role of IP in that treaty?
I won't address the treaty per se so much, but I think Mark has just illustrated part of the mismatch. I mean, we all wish there was a very simple solution, and that if there were patents waived for all of the IP related to COVID-19 products, that would solve the problem of a shortage. But I think we've seen there's so many elements in manufacturing, particularly a vaccine, that are not within a patent, and even expanding that to intellectual property and proprietary property in general. As both Mark and Simon have said, there is so much need for transferring technology and training to partners that are going to be making these vaccines that would not be covered by such a waiver. And so it would be unlikely to do two things. One is to increase the current supply, and that's assuming that we need more supply. There is a lot of supply right now. It is still structurally not getting to a lot of places that it needs, and that is, there's funding that needs to go along with that supply. So that's a whole nother, who is going to fund actually getting the vaccines in arms? Again, that's not an IP issue. And I think that's the problem here, is there's so many things that are not an IP issue. So I won't talk so much about the pandemic treaty right now, because we don't really know what that would cover. But if it will cover broader things than actually just supply, getting something to an airport, if it will actually cover the coverage of getting medicines to the patients that need it, and expanding health systems in countries that need it, it's a great thing. I think the US has gone ahead now and tried to revise some of the rules that will enable, for instance, regulatory agencies to work better together to do that. So I've gone off the IP issue there, which is kind of an illustration around the conversation, I think, that's moved on from the waiver to what's really needed. Because again, to tag back to Simon, what's really needed now is a solution to the future. How are we going to avoid this happening again? I mean, if there are instances where IP has created some kind of barrier, then we need to acknowledge that and figure out other ways to address it, and to address the hesitancy of companies in risking, if you will, how they would look at it, their IP, which, by the way, it doesn't usually just underlie a vaccine or a medicine. It's often a platform that underlies their whole portfolio, in some cases for smaller companies, or other therapeutic areas such as oncology. So how do you get beyond those concerns to incentivize them to share more, and to put countries, or at least regions, in areas where the two problems of either a vaccine or a medicine is very delayed in getting to where it's needed, or in some cases never in former times gets to where it's needed? So how do you solve that? And if that's regional manufacturing, then how do we incentivize companies to provide the transfers and the training that are needed for those countries? And in those countries, how do you get funders to fund both the development, maintaining warm bases, and to continuing that pull through into buying the output of that manufacturing facility? And again, I think we do need to move to best practices, that if governments and funders, such as CEPI, which does this, requires the transfer to regional manufacturers in lower and middle income countries, then that needs to go along with funding. And I think the converse side of that is that both IP and the guarantee of tech transfer is going to bring in more funding, because in a sense, it is a badge of acceptance and partnership with those countries and those manufacturing companies that will enable funders to justify making that money, because, making those loans, because they feel that they will get paid back those loans, which even regional funders are quite interested in doing. So I will say this is a briefcase or a package of incentives beyond the transfer of patents or even proprietary information that needs to happen. So the transfers of information need to be paired with funding. And I'm always accused of being a little bit of a contracts junkie, but all of this happens through contracts. And so these partnerships need to successfully tie both the needs of the countries that have not been adequately addressed with an overcoming the reluctance on behalf of the innovators and the manufacturers to do what they need to do to achieve worldwide availability of the output of their innovation and manufacturing. Thanks.
Thanks, Julie. Before we move on to Shanker, I just wanted to put to both Mark and Julie, I wanted to look at a sort of a more hypothetical situation or scenario, given what you've told us so far. Say, for example, in a future pandemic treaty, I'm not saying this is going to happen or is likely to happen. Say, for example, we have a TRIPS waiver that's fairly broad in scope, and we have a pandemic treaty that requires fairly strict limitations on pandemic-related IP. And what do you think the impact would be on the whole manufacturing and availability of vaccines and other technologies required for pandemics? I'll put that one to Mark first, then Julie, could you respond briefly?
Sure. In my research over the last several years, I've had the opportunity to talk to venture capitalists who invest in the biopharma sector and some of the leaders of biopharma companies. One interesting takeaway from all this is that people involved in this sector, we know they want to make money, and they don't hide that, but they also are in this sector because they care about saving lives and making people's lives better. And so they uniformly said, if there were another pandemic, we would try to step up if we could. But the problem is when you remove property rights from the equation, you start to impair their ability to respond effectively. It starts with the venture capitalists who invest in companies like Biotech and Moderna that develop this mRNA technology, for example. Most of those investments in biopharma startups, they fail. And when you invest in a biopharma company, you have to expect that risk. The one risk you can't accept is that if you succeed, then your investment will also be deprived of its value because the intellectual property rights will be taken. And at that point, those venture capital investors are compelled to look at less risky sectors like lifestyle or food and beverage, not because they're mean-spirited, but because they owe a duty to their investors. They're usually not investing their own money. They're often investing pension fund money and other institutional money in these investments. And then when you get to the biopharma companies, what they owe duties to their shareholders and their employees. And so they're going to have to be more cautious in this scenario where, they can no longer collaborate with their biggest competitors and teach them how to make things. They can no longer set up in countries, they can no longer set up facilities or enter partnerships in countries where they think there's a high risk of IP appropriation. So you start to impede the partnerships, you impede the early investments, we get less innovative technology, we get less partnering. So we might get innovation, we might get people stepping up to address the next pandemic, but their work may be less innovative, less fast, less efficient, less cooperative. We wouldn't be where we are today without having had IP rights for the last few decades, protecting these investments and partnerships.
And Julie, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. To build on that, let's go back to March of 2020. There were no vaccines. There were some background technologies and platforms that could be turned into vaccines in the beginning of development. And the companies didn't know whether there was going to be a market and whether there was a small market or a larger market. And so I think there was reluctance on the behalf many companies to engage and to begin developing vaccines. And I've spent much of my career negotiating between pharma companies, and the last 5 or so years negotiating funding agreements with companies. And I will say that one of the things they really don't like is uncertainty. And that's basically what Mark was talking about. Everything is an opportunity cost. And so if you're talking about developing something where you don't know what the market's going to be, whether you'll have any rights in anything that you invent at the end of the day, and whether that manufacturing facility should be better used for something else, then you're going to be nervous about starting to manufacture and to do the innovation in that area. And so I think this is all a balance, but how do you balance the incentive necessary to get companies that in our system make almost all of the medicines and vaccines that we need? How do you incentivize them to make these things, and to continue making them, perhaps even after there is less of an emergency and perhaps more of a return from other things, when the opportunity cost may actually exist? And I do want to mention universities, because again, the major platforms for several of the vaccines come from university innovation. And universities don't manage to license out those technologies unless a for-profit company thinks that they're worthwhile in taking those forward. So there are repercussions, in a sense, back up the chain, as well as sort of side IP, if you will, for those companies that make things like lipids and patent those. Again, these can be impediments, and there have been a couple articles recently about lipid patents and some of the adjunct IP to vaccines. But it is something that needs a very bespoke solution and incentive, and not something as broad as saying that we're not going to allow companies to benefit from IP that they may have and may develop especially for outbreaks where we need everybody to move very quickly. And also, I have not heard a good solution yet to what happens after. If there's a waiver, if there's no IP, what happens after the pandemic is declared over? And if there are a number of manufacturing facilities that are dependent on making these, and then the companies actually reinforce the patents, both the patents are reduced in value, as well as the value that the manufacturers in these lower middle income countries are making from their facilities. So a lot of complications, and I think we need to come up with a portfolio, again, of incentives to both get companies to make them, as well as to share them in ways that, from a policy perspective, countrywide and broader than that, in sort of international organizations, so that we get what we want to out of the innovations. Thanks.
Thanks, Julie. Very concisely put. And turning to Shanker, sorry for keeping you hanging on there. For those who don't know him, Shanker writes a lot on trade and competition policies, and has been an advisor, amongst other people, to the British government. So I want to really speak to him about some of the broader trade and political ramifications of the debates that are going on in Geneva. And I want to put to you, Shanker, so a lot of the way the policy discussion is heading is towards a rejection of the idea that manufacturing of pandemic technologies, including vaccines, should be concentrated in a few countries, which is what happened to an extent with the current pandemic, because companies have tended to look towards comparative advantage and economic efficiencies to get the doses out as quick as possible. So I think the policy discussion is kind of heading towards a rejection of that logic, and instead using various tools, including the waiving of IP, to disperse manufacturing more broadly geographically, including into lower income countries, as we discussed already. I wanted to get your perspective of some of the challenges around that, including, funding, if it would be cost effective, if it would be sustainable, and any other issues you think crop up from that direction of travel.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I very much enjoyed the discussion so far, and I'm going to refer to quite a lot of it actually. I mean, I'd kind of start off this with the good old physicians first do no harm. And I think Mark has, in particular, has made a number of observations about the role of intellectual property rights and the role of patent protection in particular. I think it's also very important to note that we're talking about the future, right? So you know, this is not, we certainly unfortunately don't live in a world where we've had our pandemic, it's over, it's done, we're never going to have anything like this in the future. We know we are going to have future diseases, we are going to have future pandemics, and it's incredibly important that the system that we set up here does not damage the incentives for innovation in this area, which is as he pointed out, only getting more and more expensive. I mentioned actually, interestingly, I wrote an article in 2001 about the role of patent protection and discussed, you know, things like topics that were very much being discussed at the time in terms of compulsory licensing and so forth for patents, and pointed out actually there's a lot of, then we didn't probably refer to them this way, but there are a lot of platforms like mRNA and others that could be useful in the future, and that would require a significant investment, and that many of these platforms, what we now describe as platforms, compete against each other or compete with each other. And actually there is a role for, in competition terms, in that competition between different rights holders, and that it isn't always about from a competition standpoint, it's not always about maximizing competition within only one platform. There are many ways of solving, you know, a disease problem, and you want to maximize competition across multiple platforms. Comparatively rare, actually, that a particular disease is treated in the long term by only one patented product, and so we need to sort of think about this. And with regard to TRIPS, the whole TRIPS agreement was designed, obviously, to recognize the fact that intellectual property and property rights protection was an integral part of international trade and competition. There's sometimes a misunderstanding, I think, in the competition trade sort of debate that that somehow IP and competition policies are in tension. It's often characterized that way. The reality is that they that first of all, the intellectual property right is not a, quotes, temporary monopoly designed to promote innovation. It is a species of a property right. It is what people compete with, and therefore there isn't, I think, a tension between competition policy properly applied in economic consumer welfare enhancing terms and intellectual property. I mean, there may well be a tension between intellectual property and badly applied competition policy, but that's not the normative framework in which we need to design something that's going to sort of solve this issue for us in the future. What we found is that, and I think Julie actually referred to this, that many of the challenges actually at the back end of this, in terms of getting vaccines actually out to market, are nothing to do with intellectual property at all, and more relate to things like distribution restrictions in countries. There are many countries around the world, particularly developing countries, that have very anti-competitive distribution sectors, which cause not only reduction of supply, but very high price inflation. So there are many developing countries where the distributors are taking a almost 100% profit margin markup, because they can, because of the competition restrictions in the distribution sector. And the World Bank has reported on competition restrictions and anti-competitive market distortions in the transportation sector in Africa, for example. So there are other areas that need to be a significant focus of attention in this. And one would hope that in the pandemic preparedness treaty that this is an opportunity to deal with some of these distortions, which generally are not dealt with at all. And I sort of close this by mentioning that the TRIPS does have within it a mechanism to deal with some of these issues or perceived issues in its Article 30, and that there are mechanisms in TRIPS to deal with particular problems if there is a genuine anti-competitive problem. But the mere existence of a patent is not a grounds for an anti-competitive practice. But that said, there may well be anti-competitive practices, cartels, all kinds of things could be forming, in which case you do want to have some kind of mechanism. And the TRIPS agreement does actually quite carefully find that balance and attempt to do so in a way that doesn't, throw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. So I think there are many reasons why you would want to be careful in what we do in thinking this through. And certainly the final thing that I actually wrote about this in both a paper in 2001 and a book I wrote about it in 2007. You have to also look at who the beneficiaries of something like a TRIPS waiver or a compulsory license. This discussion about a compulsory license of patented products has been around, for 20 plus years. And so there's quite a lot of data on who the beneficiary actually is. I mean, is the beneficiary actually the ultimate end consumer, or are the benefits given to a narrow group of firms and companies that can then produce the product, and that actually isn't a significant benefit to the consumer, which has been the case in a number of countries around the world where patents have not been well protected. That's what I keep saying finally, but this is definitely the very final thing I want to mention was.
I wanted to actually get you to expand on that point. In the discussions around the TRIPS waiver and other related discussions in Geneva, do you detect, or do you think there's a risk of industrial policies getting conflated with public health objectives?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the TRIPS waiver doesn't come out of nothing. I mean, it comes out of a long discussion that's been going on in the WTO and has been going on between countries on the role of compulsory licenses and on the sort of advocacy by some. And we have to recognize that, this is, there are industries that benefit from compulsory licenses and benefit from a reduction in patent protection, and they just like everybody else, they have a voice and they have a view, and they express that view to governments. And so I think there is a significant risk, and I think the way you would handle this is you would look at all the benefits that arise from the system as it currently is set up. You look at what happens to those benefits if you start to undermine some of those protections, which is what we're talking about here in terms of a TRIPS waiver or compulsory license, and you see who the beneficiaries are. And sometimes, you might want to undermine a particular protection because the beneficiaries are so enormous, or the urgency is so great, or there could be other policy considerations. But certainly what we found is that the beneficiaries of the compulsory license tend not to be the ultimate consumers. They tend to be those industries who then are motivated by other competition concerns. And in fact, what we also found in the 2001 paper was that in a lot of countries where you have lax IP protection, or lack of enforcement of IP protection or patent protection, is you do get a significant amount of cartel-like behavior amongst the beneficiaries of those compulsory licenses, or that lack of protection. And so the price point becomes a little bit lower than the patent price point, but not significantly. because you've got other competition restrictions at play. So you have to put all of this into the mix as a policymaker and say, well, what is the net objective that I'm trying to reach? And I think, again, the net objective is much more about the many, many restrictions and the many, many competition restrictions in the distribution of these things, particularly in developing countries. And also, what do we want to do in terms of sustainability, which part of your question was sustainability and funding for some of these things. And I come back to the role of venture capital that Mark mentioned. What you saw in South Korea was quite instructive here. You saw a massive increase in venture capital firms when the South Koreans improved their intellectual property protection with a new patent law. So you do see a direct, what he talked about is absolutely backed by the data, that you do see a direct correlation between the size and the scale of venture capital firms and the level of patent protection for obvious reasons. And this cannot be done solely by governments. I mean, you need to activate private-public partnerships here. You need to activate the private sector for some of this funding, and it simply won't happen if the entire ecosystem of trust, if you will, that's based on the protection of property has been undermined. So I think there's a lot in the negative column here, and there's not a lot in the positive column. And it may well be that the positive column, which we need to address, actually needs a whole set of other policy prescriptions that are in the competition space, but they're just not competition and the IP, right? They're competition and distribution, transportation, a lot of other sectors that we do need to deal with.
Thanks, Shanker. You've covered a lot of ground very, very quickly. We've only got 3 minutes left. Unfortunately, there's a lot more we could be unpacking. I'd just like to return to all the panelists and kind of sum up, if you could, in 1 or 2 sentences. Could you give like your top 2 to 3 things that should be done at an international and national level to promote access to vaccines in the cases of future pandemics? I'll put that to Simon first of all, as a sort of sum up.
Well, I think that Shankar set it up. The key thing is the African manufacturers are not talking about donations. This has been happening on the continent for 50 years. Nothing has happened. So we are basically calling for investments. We want people that will invest, and if you discourage that, nothing is going to happen, because anybody that wants to invest wants to recoup their investment. So we are calling for investments in the ventures that the manufacturers on the continent are pushing, not donations. And like Julie and Mark clearly said, we don't want to kill innovations. The role of IP is clear, where, like I said, there are procedures for making this happen. If you have the capacity, you can always license in technologies, which is the partnership between the 2 entities, the provider, the recipient, and then becomes a win-win situation. Or you design around, and that is when you have the capacity to do that. But we are too early to start talking about challenging weak patterns. So we're focusing on 2, license in, and that's why we're talking about willingness of the giver of the technology to license the technology to the continent, or we design around the existing pattern. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. And Mark, do you want to add anything to that briefly?
3 recommendations. So first, advanced purchase commitments were really important in ensuring a market and incentive to manufacture the vaccines in sufficient doses. but they put the countries that made these contracts first in line. So we need to create large pools of countries with these kind of contracts, advanced contracts, rather than just a few. Second, remove trade and regulatory barriers. We need more regulatory harmonization. We need to not interrupt the supply chain during a pandemic. And just a quick example of that, it's possible sometimes that when a vaccine is manufactured and put in a vial and labeled for distribution in a particular country, that is it. It can't be necessarily be diverted to another country that might need it because the regulatory regimes aren't harmonized. And then third, I'm just going to repeat it, improve distribution capabilities. It's not exciting. It's not something that's easily discussed in a conference room in Geneva near that beautiful lake. It's an on-the-ground, tough, nitty-gritty issue, but that's where the investment needs to be made so the treatments actually get to patients. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark and Julie.
Funders, both private funders and governments, need to include in their agreements requirements that companies transfer the technologies necessary to regions that need to make those to make sure that we get global coverage. And the funding to do that through, as Mark said, purchasing those vaccines at the end or medicines at the end of the day need to be a continual process and not something that is cut off after a year or two when other emergencies tend to take those funding sources away. So basically it is making sure that the contracts to develop these and to purchase them. So when a country purchases doses, and again, most of the high income countries took up a lot of the doses in their initial bilateral agreements, that they make sure that those purchase agreements include providing countries and regions that can't enter into those agreements themselves with a proportion of those doses purchased. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. And Shanker, as a fellow Brit, I'll give you the last word.
Thank you. I would say the first thing I would say would be, first recommendation would be ensure that you are diagnosing the problem you're trying to solve properly. And I think the significant amount of work, which hasn't really happened, needs to be done in terms of distribution, transportation, these sorts of restrictions, the distortions that exist in these sectors, why they're there, how we can deal with them, how we can use or improve the sort of overall WTO framework to deliver that. And the second thing I would say is just remember this is about the future, not the past. And don't undermine systems that have got you to the position that you're in now in a way that may help you in the short term with the current issue, but will damage a lot of people and lead to no solution in the future when we inevitably will face these kinds of problems, maybe far worse problems than this one in the future. So those would be my two recommendations.
Great. Well, thanks very much to everyone for joining us. It's been a fascinating discussion. This will be made available on our website, hopefully by tomorrow. Sorry, we're a little bit over time. But thanks again to all the panelists and thanks to everyone out there for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Geneva Network webinar. Good morning and good afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.